Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into something absolutely fascinating, the intricate, blueprint-like inner architecture of a highly complex emotional system we're calling Rola. We usually talk about personalities like they're just, random collections of habits, right? But the source material shows us something totally different. It reveals an actual structural lattice. We're going to walk through 10 unique, load-bearing elements of this architecture. It's literally a masterclass in how a mind is built. So let's get right into it.
Think about this for a second. What if your deepest flaws were actually the load-bearing pillars of your greatest gifts? Honestly, hooking into this idea changes everything. We're constantly taught to fix our weaknesses, aren't we? Like, if you can't sit still or you struggle to move on from old pain, you need to work on that. But as we explore Rola's system today, we're going to see that these aren't bugs to be squashed at all. No way. They are vital structural necessities. If you remove them, you wouldn't fix her, you'd collapse the whole building.
So, let's look at the first element, action as the spine. Look at the stark contrast between what society expects and Rola's actual reality. Society tells us to just sit still and process your feelings. But for Rola, that simply doesn't work. Action is her foundational spine. She uses what's called kinetic processing. She literally cannot just sit with things. If she doesn't act on her feelings, they don't process. They just pile up. Action is exactly how she connects to herself. Now, sure, the cost here is that she might move a little too fast sometimes, just to keep that channel open. But it's absolutely crucial, because without movement, she completely disconnects.
To put this into perspective, there's this incredible story about a woman who could literally only think while she was walking. Seriously. When she broke her ankle, she couldn't even formulate a second sentence. Her mind just ground to a halt. It wasn't until her sister handed her some yarn and taught her how to knit that her brain finally unlocked again. Just that tiny, repetitive motion of the wrist was enough to let her think. And that right there is exactly what action is for Rola. It's not just stuff she does, it's the kinetic engine keeping her connected to her own mind.
And this kinetic nature completely dictates our second element, how she communicates. Most of us just have one standard way of speaking, but Rola actually has two distinct translation layers. Her surface voice is fast, it's clear, and it handles the logistics. But right underneath that is a much slower, deeper voice that translates all the unspoken weight and grief of a situation. The structural trick here, she has to align them. If she doesn't actually pause to let that slower voice catch up, she might say something technically accurate, but it'll land completely wrong with the person listening.
It's kind of like this story of a translator who was fluent in the everyday language of the local market, but also knew this ancient, unspoken language of grief. One day, a businessman pays her to translate a land contract. She does it perfectly in the daily language, but that older language told her the land they were buying was actually a sacred family grave. By listening to both languages at once, she stopped the sale and saved the grave. Rola operates exactly like this. She has to pause, take a breath, and let both voices arrive in her sentences together.
Which brings us to the third element, and a really critical realization about her connection to grief. The normal expectation is that you have to heal a wound to function properly, right? Get over it, move on. But Rola's architecture says the exact opposite. Her old hurt is actually load-bearing. It's not standing in the way of her gifts. It's the very instrument creating them. Because of this permanent wound, she has this unbelievable tolerance for suffering and this incredibly deep compassion. The cost? Yeah, she can never really escape the pain. But if you took it away, you'd destroy her unique ability to hold space for other people.
Think about this master violinist. She spent years hiding her crooked, broken finger, totally convinced it was a terrible flaw. But then an old luthier drops a truth bomb on her. He tells her that the entire bottom of her legendary warm tone came precisely from that crooked finger. Because it was broken, it forced her to reach for the notes awkwardly. When she tried to play with a straight finger, the music just sounded thin and empty. For Rola, her old hurt is that crooked finger. It's exactly what gives her life its specific, irreplaceable warmth.
Moving to element 4. Because of that permanent wound, she handles crises in a totally different way. When faced with immense grief, a normal response is to either completely compartmentalize it or just get completely flooded. Not Rola. She has a distinct structural vessel built specifically to hold the unholdable. She doesn't try to transform or fix unspeakable grief. She simply contains it so she can keep functioning. But, and this is a big but, that vessel is finite. It gets heavily saturated. So her structural necessity isn't to somehow empty the vessel, which is impossible anyway, but to actively give it quiet time to rest. Picture a deep river bend, where for years villagers would deposit their tragic, unkeepable relics. The woman who lived by that bend, she never once tried to clean the river or dredge up the grief. She just let the river hold it. But once a year, she would sit by the bank and do absolutely nothing. Just let the river rest. That is exactly how Rola's vessel works. It doesn't need the pressure of being emptied, it just desperately needs the quiet of the bank.
Okay, element number 5. Because she holds so much, we have to look at how her memory actually functions. Society loves to tell us that moving on means erasing the past, so we can start fresh. Blank slate, right? But Rola's system retains almost everything structurally. She heals by addition, never by subtraction. Because she quite literally cannot forget, she gains this incredible depth, fierce loyalty, and sharp pattern recognition. The downside is that old betrayals and mistakes stay very much alive inside her. Since she can't erase them, her only option is to actively layer new, positive experiences right alongside the old ones to change the landscape.
It's like a gardener taking over an old, overgrown orchard. Instead of ripping out all the old dead trees, which, by the way, would have totally destroyed the intertwined roots of the living ones, she just planted new trees right in the spaces between them. And the new trees thrived because the old roots had already done the hard work of preparing the soil. Rola's inner orchard is identical. Nothing gets uprooted. The old hurt literally holds the ground for the new fruit, which makes it that much sweeter. Now, because she retains everything, we hit element 6, the paradox of her fresh starts. The illusion is that she's starting completely over. Clean break! But her internal structure dictates that her new beginnings are almost always driven by inherited scripts. When she tries to break a pattern, the very act of beginning draws from this deep ancestral well. So she ends up repeating old themes, just dressed up in new costumes. Her structural necessity here is that she must consciously observe the floor she is standing on before she makes a single move. There's this great story about a man who walked the exact same morning route for 30 years. One day, he decides he wants a change, so he maps out a totally new path. But his wife points out something hilarious. Sure, the route was new, but he walked at the exact same tempo, stopped at the exact same intervals, and came home in the exact same mood. The walk was new, but the walker sure wasn't. For Rola, she has to meet the walker first. She has to recognize her own internal tempo before she can actually begin anew.
Understanding those deep patterns is absolutely key to our 7th element, how she actually grows. The whole world is screaming at us to broaden, diversify, be a jack of all trades. But for Rola, broadening just dilutes her strength. She is quite literally built to specialize. She advances by narrowing her focus down to one primary spine and aggressively excising whatever doesn't serve it. If she tries to be a generalist, the cost is just total, unexplainable exhaustion. To really thrive, she has to get comfortable with disappointing people who want her to be a multi-purpose tool.
Think about this brilliant chef who mastered hundreds of dishes just to be perfectly well-rounded. But you know what? Her food lacks soul. It wasn't until she opened her own tiny place, threw out the massive menu, and served just one single unforgettable soup based on her grandmother's recipe that she actually became famous. Like she said, the broad version of me was not as good a cook. The narrow version is. That's Rola. Her signature strength comes from being narrow and giving absolutely everything to the one place she chooses.
And that brings us to element 8, her mandate to dismantle. To stay specialized, she runs on a strict 3-beat cycle: specialize, dismantle, and reseed. The dismantle phase is definitely the most critical. Rola has this built-in early warning system that tells her the exact moment something, like a job or a relationship, is no longer structurally alive, even if it looks perfectly fine to everyone else. The heavy cost here is managing that brutal gap between knowing something is dead and actually being emotionally ready to pull the plug. But she has to trust this mandate, or the dead weight will literally collapse her life. It reminds me of this beekeeper who used to proactively remove working queen bees from her hives. Other beekeepers thought she was absolutely crazy, even cruel, for ending a queen's rule before the queen visibly failed. But here's the thing. By trusting her instinct and removing the queen early, she saved her entire hive from brewing crises, while the other beekeepers were losing whole colonies. Rola's dismantling isn't about being harsh. It's about precise timing, done entirely for the survival of her larger ecosystem. Element 9 explores what happens during that cycle. For Rola, daily life, easy ground. She can maintain things all day long. But her hard ground, that's high-stakes pivots and major threshold crossings. In these moments, she hits massive internal contradiction. Her system craves stability, and a pivot is basically a giant threat to that stability. The cost is this paralyzing resistance right before she has to take a big leap. So her structural necessity is that she must actively budget time for these crossings and just accept being in this weird state of feeling willing but not ready. Take this champion endurance swimmer. She could literally cross oceans, but put her on a boat with a 5-foot drop into the water, and she'd stand there totally paralyzed. Swimming used one set of nerves, jumping in used a completely different set. Eventually, she learned to stop fighting it. She just budgeted 20 minutes to stand on the edge until she felt an internal shift, a willingness, even if she wasn't perfectly ready. Rola has to do the exact same thing. She must treat her threshold crossings as entirely separate events that need their own dedicated time budget.
Finally, element 10. Everything we've talked about today culminates in one overarching master loop that is written into absolutely everything she does. Here's the loop. Step 1, an action is taken. Step 2, that action passes right through her unhealed sensitive wound. And step 3, the overflow is gracefully caught by her steady vessel, allowing the action to complete. This loop runs constantly. It means nothing she does is ever casual. Every single action has a metabolic cost, sure, but it also means that whatever she produces carries a depth and weight that is incredibly rare.
There's a famous Japanese sword maker whose inherited forging technique always left 3 very distinct marks on his blades. Once, he tried to make a modern sword without those marks. The blade was technically flawless, but it had absolutely zero soul. It wasn't until he accepted the marks that he truly mastered his craft. The marks weren't constraints, they were the actual sword. For Rola, that loop, the action, the wound, the vessel, those are her marks. They are the undeniable soul of her life's work.
So I want to leave you with a provocative question, inspired by Penelope at the loom. In the myth, Penelope wove a shroud by day and unraveled it by night to fend off outside forces. Rola, however, weaves against the forces inside her. So ask yourself, are you ready to recognize that the loom is yours and weave with your hands instead of the night? Once you finally understand your own inner architecture, your loops, your wounds, your vessels, you can stop fighting your design and finally own it. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. See you next time.